Emergency dispatch.
My daughter's been missing since this morning. She's 8 months pregnant.
The FBI is now joining the search for a missing California woman who is 8 months pregnant.
Her husband reported her missing after he returned from a fishing trip, a trip he took by himself.
Please bring our daughter home.
You know in your gut that something bad has happened.
Are you in any way connected to Lacey's disappearance?
I had nothing to do with Lacey's disappearance.
This is a Fox Report News alert. 2 bodies found in Richmond, California.
Lacey and her unborn child did not deserve to die.
Scott Peterson was arrested for the murder of his wife.
We, the jury, further find the degree of the murder to be that of the first degree.
There was nobody in that courtroom that had a dry eye, but Scott didn't cry.
For Scott Peterson, his story is what matters.
People were so fascinated and drawn into this case because Scott and Lacey Peterson seemed like the perfect couple, a storybook romance, a charming young man who was very attentive and very focused on this very sweet, beautiful young girl.
Many people have described Scott and Lacey as the all-American perfect couple. Scott Peterson was a fertilizer salesman at the time that this all happened. He radiated charm. He was this handsome man who was educated, who had, a good career ahead of him, who really seemed like he had it all together. Lacey, for her part, was a school teacher, and by all accounts, everybody who knew Lacey described her as this bubbly, caring, social, fun-loving person. And she was expecting, and you could almost feel the community, the neighborhood they lived in, they were rooting for them.
So there it was, December 24th, 2002, Christmas Eve, a young couple in love with everything to look forward to in the future, celebrating with their families, a new baby boy on the way, when all of a sudden, Lacey Peterson vanishes.
Lacey Peterson is 8 months pregnant and she is still missing tonight.
Modesto police say 27-year-old Lacey Peterson was last seen walking her dog in a neighborhood park on Christmas Eve.
Police admit they are no closer to finding Lacey Peterson than they were on Christmas Eve, the day she vanished.
The day before Christmas Eve, the last time anybody has heard or seen Lacey, everything seems normal. At 8:30 p.m., she has a conversation with her mother on the phone. They talk about what happens the next day. But the next day, there's this huge gap of time that nobody really knows for sure what happened, except for Scott Peterson. He says that Lacey is preparing, for Christmas Eve. She's watching Martha Stewart, and she's getting ready to go about her day.
Scott Peterson decides to leave his very pregnant wife and go fishing instead. He takes his new boat that he had purchased, and he comes here to launch the boat.
Her husband reported her missing after he returned from a fishing trip, a trip he took by himself.
Her husband says he went fishing at marina the day she disappeared, so investigators are searching that marina.
The mystery here in Modesto fueled in large part by Scott Peterson's alibi, which remains flimsy at best.
He comes home later in the day, realizes that she's not there, figures she's somewhere else, running errands, doing something for Christmas Eve, and takes the time to put his clothes in the wash, take a shower, have a snack, and then realizes maybe I should call somebody.
So here's what's unusual. Scott decides to call Lacey's mother. Doesn't say, have you spoken to Lacey today? Do you know where she is? He says, Lacey is missing.
The word missing right away struck a chord with everybody. When you hear Sharon Rocha describe that moment and what that was like, the ground going out from underneath you, your heart sinking to the floor. What do you mean missing? That's a very important word.
How can I help you?
My son-in-law called. He went playing golf this morning at 9:30. My daughter's been missing since this morning. She's 8 months pregnant.
The clock is ticking in this case. Lacey Peterson is 8 months pregnant. She needs medical care. Her family is desperate to find her.
You get the call from Modesto police. When they describe the situation, you're just like, okay, it's a missing woman, 8.5 months pregnant. And so we kind of launched it from there and went out to the neighborhood, and that's how it all started.
Having worked as a former prosecutor in Los Angeles District Attorney's Office in San Francisco, this was the type of case and my area of expertise, so I was initially just very fascinated by it.
I was a radio reporter working in Los Angeles at the time. My first reaction when I saw that story was, let's go. It's Christmas. This woman is missing. We need to help.
I'm a forensic psychiatrist, and the story of Scott Peterson caught my attention because people were saying, how could it be that somebody who seemed like the boy next door, your neighbor, would do such a thing?
The fact, I think, that Laci Peterson sprung up so quickly was she was young, she was attractive, she was pregnant. That made it of interest, but it became of more interest when very early on, within a day or two, the police went to his home to look for any evidence.
The FBI came down last night and assisted in the processing the home and the vehicles, so they used a chemical process to try to detect any trace evidence or blood.
Investigators confirm they have a receipt from the marina where Scott said he went fishing on December 24th. Even so, they've hauled in his computer and his car and have not ruled him out as a suspect.
You want to look at an investigation when you bring somebody, a potential suspect, in for questioning. How do they behave? What is their emotion? Do they show concern? What's really remarkable is that when Scott is brought in for questioning, he is totally calm, doesn't seem concerned at all, not alarmed, which to me tells, as a former prosecutor, something is very off in his demeanor.
When you begin to cover a story like this, you want to hear from the spouse. You want to hear from the husband. The closest person to Laci is Scott, but we weren't getting that connection with Scott. So right away, I felt something's not right about this.
When you think about what it would be like for you with the person that you love the most, what would you be doing? Most of us would say, I would be out pounding on the doors. I would be out screaming from the rooftop, where is she? I would be out calling her name.
He wasn't at the forefront. He wasn't the one kind of leading the search for his missing wife.
You see it from the other family members, that desperate grief, that desperate fear. Where is she? Is she cold? Is she okay? Does somebody have her? How do we get her?
We've been through so much these last days that I'd like to make a plea to the person or persons who have my daughter. Please bring our daughter home.
I miss your beautiful smile and your fun-loving personality. Every time we were together, I could feel the unconditional love between the both of us.
And then you cut to what he looked like, what he sounded like.
Today, how were you remembering your wife and your son?
That's very personal to me. I'm going to continue to look for, obviously. And there are times when it's difficult to go on, obviously, because so thanks very much.
None of it felt right. None of it felt like this was a man who's being truthful.
Really, he has multiple signs and symptoms of someone who has sociopathy or antisocial personality disorder. I'm not diagnosing him with that because I didn't interview him. But the key to that is a lack of empathy.
Of course, people can handle stress and or grief or concern in many different ways. But it's the rest of the story that adds up that shows that Scott Peterson did something terribly wrong.
Scott has hired a lawyer. He's been keeping a very low profile. All of this has landed him squarely under a cloud of suspicion.
Mr. Peterson and anybody else connected with this investigation will be considered and is considered a suspect.
At the time, the public was already becoming suspicious of Scott Peterson.
As more and more information came out about Scott, and I'm learning more from law enforcement on what's happening, I realized they were zeroing in on Scott. We just knew his actions were suspicious and something was going on, and clearly his fishing story was not adding up.
One of the things you do as a reporter is you go up and down, you talk to everybody that you possibly can. I went over to the neighbor's house that lives directly across the street. The neighbor remembered Scott coming over to her house looking for Laci, and she said, well, where were you? It's Christmas Eve. And he said, I was playing golf. The fact that that story differed from what we then heard was his alibi and where he says he was very upsetting.
Scott was being followed by the press everywhere. All of his emotion, his behavior, his actions were documented.
I approached him one day and I said, Scott, you really should talk. You really need to get out there and tell people how much you miss your wife and how much you need her to come home. And he says, you know what? He says, if I decide to talk, you'll be one of the 3 reporters I talk to.